When the game ends, there is a silence that feels heavier than any crowd noise that came before it. It arrives slowly, almost politely, as if the stadium itself is aware that something important has passed. Seats empty, lights dim. The field that once held meaning becomes just grass again. This is the moment most people never sit with long enough because silence forces reflection. And reflection raises questions the sport does not like to answer. I have spent years thinking about that silence. Not just the quiet after a game, but the quiet that follows decisions made far from the field. Football teaches us to believe in structure, lines drawn with precision, rules written to create fairness. A promise that everyone plays under the same conditions, bound by the same standards, protected by the same system. That belief is what allows the violence to make sense. Pain feels acceptable when it exists inside rules we trust. But trust has conditions. And once those conditions are violated, everything that follows feels different. There is a version of a football season that never gets discussed. It does not end with a torn ligament or a brutal hit. It ends with a decision, a ruling, a calculation. A moment when someone in power decides that enforcing the rules will cost more than breaking them. For the player living inside that season, it feels like disappearance. Not dramatic, not public, just quiet and final. We tend to talk about careers as if they end naturally. Age, injury, decline. But some careers are altered by choices made in offices, not stadiums. Choices that never show up on injury reports. Choices that are explained away or never explained at all. Choices that redefine fairness while pretending nothing has changed. From the outside, football promises order. It tells us there is a right way to play and a wrong way to play. That the league exists to uphold that difference. That violations are punished because without punishment, the game loses meaning. But what happens when the violation belongs to the league itself? That question sits at the heart of this story. The most damaging rule violations are not committed by players chasing advantage on the field. They are committed by institutions protecting themselves from consequences. When the people responsible for enforcement decide that some rules no longer apply, the game does not collapse. It adjusts. And that adjustment leaves damage that is rarely traced back to its source. I have listened to former players describe moments when they realized something was wrong but could not name it. Outcomes that felt predetermined. Rulings that made no sense. Investigations that went quiet without resolution. They were not talking about bad luck. They were talking about trust slipping away. Slowly enough that it could be doubted, but powerfully enough that it was never forgotten. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice. Every major institution reaches a point where its own survival conflicts with its stated values. The NFL reached that point long ago. When revenue, reputation, and credibility are placed on one side of the scale, enforcement begins to look optional. Transparency begins to look dangerous. And truth becomes something to manage rather than reveal. What makes this especially difficult to confront is how well it works. Fans keep watching. Seasons keep moving. History continues to be written as if nothing was interrupted. The league grows, expands, and presents itself as proof that whatever happened could not have been that serious. Success becomes its own defense, but the cost does not disappear. It moves. It settles into the lives of players who trusted a system that had already decided how much truth it could afford. It settles into record books that reflect outcomes shaped by invisible hands. It settles into a culture where silence is mistaken for resolution. I think often about the idea of fairness, how fragile it is, how dependent it is on good faith. Fairness is not just about equal rules. It is about consistent enforcement. Once enforcement becomes selective, fairness becomes a performance, something that looks convincing enough to satisfy most people, while failing those closest to it. When a league hides its own violation, it sends a message that some rules exist only until they are inconvenient, that some truths are negotiable. that integrity has limits. And once that message is internalized, it influences every response that follows. Future scandals, future investigations, future promises of reform. The violation at the center of this documentary was not hidden because it was small. It was hidden because it threatened too much. It threatened outcomes that could not be reversed. Legacies that could not be revisited without destabilizing belief in the league itself. The NFL understood that correcting the mistake would cost more than absorbing the consequences silently. So silence was chosen. Not because it was right, but because it was effective. Years passed, headlines shifted. New stars replaced old ones. The league refined its language, its policies, its messaging. Outwardly, it evolved. Inwardly, it learned a lesson that would shape its future responses to controversy. That survival depends on control of information. That accountability can be delayed until it loses force. That truth does not have to be denied if it is never fully acknowledged. This is not a story about villains in the traditional sense. It is about structure, about incentives, about how systems protect themselves without needing malice. People acted logically within a framework that rewarded preservation and punished disruption. Understanding that does not excuse the outcome, but it does explain why it happened. And it explains why similar patterns keep repeating. Every time the league faces a crisis, the same question quietly appears. Will enforcing the rules strengthen trust, or will it expose fractures that cannot be repaired? More often than not, the answer has favored concealment. Not full denial, but partial truth. Enough transparency to appear cooperative. Enough silence to avoid reckoning. The result is a history shaped as much by what was withheld as by what was celebrated. As a fan, it is tempting to believe that if something truly damaging had occurred, it would have destroyed the league. That the truth would have surfaced in a way that could not be managed. But power rarely collapses under exposure alone. It adapts, it reframes. It absorbs criticism and continues forward. The NFL did not hide its biggest rule violation and survive by accident. It survived because hiding it worked. And once an institution learns that lesson, it becomes part of its operating logic. Silence becomes a tool. Delay becomes a strategy. Enforcement becomes conditional. This documentary is about tracing that logic back to its source. About understanding not just what was hidden, but why hiding it felt necessary. About asking what fairness means in a system that reserves the right to redefine it when the stakes are high enough. The silence after the game tells us more than the noise ever could. Because in silence, we are forced to confront what we believed and why we believed it. We are forced to ask whether the rules we trusted were ever as solid as we assumed. When the league hit its biggest rule violation, it did more than protect itself in the moment. It changed the relationship between the game and the truth. It proved that silence could preserve power, and that lesson has never stopped shaping the league we watch today. Every professional sport survives on belief, but the National Football League depends on something more specific. It depends on the assumption that its outcomes are legitimate. That wins are earned. That losses are final. That no matter how violent or chaotic the game becomes, there is a framework standing above it all that keeps competition honest. That framework is the rulebook. The NFL rulebook is not just a collection of guidelines. It is the league's moral contract with players, teams, and fans. It defines what is allowed, what is punished, and what constitutes fairness. Without it, football is not sport. It is spectacle without meaning. And yet, the rulebook only matters if it is enforced consistently, even when enforcement is inconvenient. Understanding that distinction is essential to this story. Most fans are conditioned to think of rule violations as on-field events: a late hit, a missed call, a controversial flag thrown or not thrown in a crucial moment. These incidents are visible, debated immediately, and then absorbed into the mythology of the game. They are accepted as human error, part of the drama, part of the risk of competition. But institutional violations are fundamentally different. They occur off the field. They are systemic rather than incidental. They involve decision-makers, not players. And most importantly, they alter the conditions under which competition takes place without the consent or awareness of those participating. A league-level rule violation is not a mistake. It is a choice. It is a moment when enforcement is knowingly suspended, reinterpreted, or delayed to protect the league's broader interests. It is when the guardians of fairness decide that fairness must bend for stability. And because these decisions happen outside the public eye, their consequences can be enormous while remaining largely invisible. The NFL has always insisted that its credibility is rooted in order. From its earliest days, league leadership emphasized structure as a selling point. Football was marketed as disciplined violence, chaos constrained by rules. That image allowed the league to grow, to separate itself from disorganized competitors, and to present itself as a professional institution worthy of national trust. But professionalism brought pressure. As the league expanded, enforcement became more complicated. Early on, discretion was informal and often justified by necessity. Teams folded. Owners struggled to survive. The league adapted on the fly. Rules existed, but consistency was secondary to survival. Those early compromises did not disappear when the league stabilized. They became precedent. Over time, discretion evolved into selective enforcement. The NFL learned that not every violation needed to be addressed publicly, that consequences could be shaped. That timing mattered. A punishment delayed is often a punishment diminished. A rule clarified after the fact is a rule quietly rewritten. And once these tools proved effective, they were used again. Journalist Lester Munson once observed that professional sports leagues rarely lie outright. They simply release information strategically. That observation applies here. The NFL's approach to controversy has historically relied on partial transparency. Enough disclosure to appear cooperative. Enough silence to avoid full accountability. Former players have hinted at this reality for years. Hall of Fame center Mike Webster once said that the game changed for him when he realized the league did not know how to protect players and was not honest about that fact. While his story is often framed solely through the lens of health, it also reflects a broader institutional pattern. The league acknowledged problems only when denial was no longer sustainable. That pattern extends beyond player safety. Investigative journalists such as Don Van Natta Jr. and Ken Belson have documented how the NFL manages crises through internal processes designed to minimize exposure. Independent investigations are often limited in scope. Findings are summarized rather than released. Language is carefully chosen to avoid admissions of fault. These practices are not unique to the NFL, but the scale at which they operate is. The league's cultural dominance means that even significant revelations must overcome public inertia. Fans have learned to separate enjoyment from scrutiny. Sunday arrives regardless of what happened during the week. This documentary is not interested in relitigating isolated incidents. It is concerned with how institutional decisions shape reality over time. How one hidden violation can establish a template for managing future threats. How a precedent, once set, quietly governs behavior long after its origins are forgotten. The central violation explored in this series meets 3 criteria. First, it involved a clear breach of the league's own stated rules or procedures. Second, league leadership was aware of the breach at the time it occurred. Third, public acknowledgement would have required consequences that the league determined were unacceptable. These are the violations that matter most because they reveal priorities. Rather than framing this story as an exposé, this documentary approaches it as an examination of process. How decisions are made, who is involved, what incentives are present, and how outcomes are rationalized internally. Understanding these mechanisms is essential to understanding why similar controversies continue to surface decades later. This is also why the story unfolds gradually. The 10 chapters that follow are not isolated case studies. They are interconnected steps in a larger evolution. Early moments of discretion normalize flexibility. Financial pressures reward silence. Ownership influence reshapes enforcement. Media cooperation stabilizes narrative. And eventually, a violation emerges that is too large to confront directly. By the time that moment arrives, the tools for hiding it are already in place. Throughout this series, documented statements and reporting will anchor the narrative. Not speculation, not rumor. Words spoken by players who lived inside the system. Journalists who spent years tracking patterns rather than headlines. League officials whose language reveals more in what it avoids than in what it declares. Former linebacker Chris Borland once said that what troubled him most was not the hits, but the realization that the system he trusted was not designed to protect him fully. That insight is relevant here. Institutional design reflects priorities, and priorities become visible through behavior, not slogans. This documentary asks the viewer to think beyond outcomes and focus on governance. Beyond wins and losses and toward legitimacy. Because when rule enforcement becomes negotiable, competition becomes conditional. The goal is not to tell viewers what to think, but to show them how decisions accumulate, how silence compounds, how a single choice sets a precedent that shapes decades of response. By the end of this journey, the question will no longer be whether the league hid its biggest rule violation. The question will be what that decision reveals about how the NFL defines fairness, accountability, and truth. And once that question is fully understood, it becomes impossible to watch the game the same way again. To understand how the league learned to bend its own rules, I had to go back to a time before the NFL was powerful enough to protect anything. In the beginning, it was fragile, unstable, a collection of teams struggling not for dominance, but for survival. That context matters, because rules behave differently when existence itself feels uncertain. In the early decades of professional football, stability was not guaranteed. Teams folded regularly. Owners lost money. Players floated between leagues, searching for paychecks that could disappear without warning. The NFL wanted legitimacy, but legitimacy costs money, and money was scarce. So the league learned early that rules were ideals, not absolutes. Owners understood this instinctively. If strict enforcement threatened a franchise, enforcement became flexible. If punishment risked collapse, it was delayed or softened. These were not decisions made with malice. They were made with fear. The league presented itself as organized competition, but behind the scenes, it operated as a survival network. Teams borrowed players. Owners shared resources. Contracts were vague by design. And enforcement was inconsistent because consistency often meant consequences the league could not afford. This was the environment where discretionary rule enforcement was born. One of the earliest lessons the NFL absorbed was that stability mattered more than fairness in the short term. If a rule threatened the existence of a team or a market, that rule became negotiable. Not eliminated, just postponed. It's not denied, just reinterpreted. The league told itself it could address integrity once it secured longevity. That logic never fully went away. In these early years, rules were enforced differently depending on who was affected. Powerful owners were given latitude. Smaller franchises were reminded of obligations. Enforcement was real but uneven. And uneven enforcement teaches an organization something dangerous. It teaches that fairness is adjustable. The league learned that fans did not see the rules the way officials did. Fans cared about outcomes, about winners, about continuity. If a team vanished overnight due to strict adherence to policy, fans blamed instability, not fairness. That insight became foundational. I found it striking how often early league meetings focused not on whether a rule had been broken, but on whether enforcement would create embarrassment or financial harm. The question was rarely what was right. It was what was survivable. This survival mindset hardened into habit. As franchises stabilized and revenues increased, the discretionary culture remained. Enforcement did not snap into consistency overnight. Instead, discretion became a silent privilege that accompanied power. The more valuable a franchise became, the more caution surrounded decisions that might damage it. The NFL began to separate rule enforcement into two categories: public rules for players and coaches, private discretion for owners and league officials. That division was never written down, but it was understood. Former Commissioner Pete Rozelle would later speak publicly about protecting the league from itself. That phrase was revealing. Protecting the league did not always mean enforcing rules. Sometimes it meant shielding the institution from fallout. This mindset emerged long before modern television deals or billion-dollar valuations. It took root when the league was still fragile enough to believe that exposure could be fatal. The early NFL also learned the value of time. Immediate punishment drew attention. Delayed action reduced scrutiny. By the time consequences arrived, if they arrived at all, interest had faded. The issue felt resolved even if it never truly was. Time became one of the league's most effective tools. It was during this era that enforcement quietly began to depend on who stood to be hurt by enforcement. Was it a marginal player or a marketable star? A struggling franchise or a cornerstone of league identity? The rulebook did not change, but its application did. None of this was framed publicly as favoritism. It was framed internally as pragmatism. The league told itself that survival justified flexibility. That once stability was achieved, consistency could follow. But that promise was never fulfilled, because flexibility had become functional. This approach also shaped a relationship between the league and its owners. Owners learned that consequences were negotiable. That enforcement was a conversation, not a certainty. That influence mattered. And once owners understand that leverage exists, they use it. What started as survival economics became governance culture. This is where precedent matters. Not legal precedent, but behavioral precedent. When an organization learns that bending rules prevents short-term harm, it is likely to bend them again. When it learns that silence prevents outrage, silence becomes policy. The early NFL normalized the idea that enforcement was secondary to stability. That belief did not feel dangerous at the time. It felt responsible. The league survived. It grew. The decisions worked. But what works during formation becomes problematic at scale. As revenues increased and public scrutiny intensified, the league carried this discretionary instinct forward without reevaluating its cost. Rules still existed, but they were applied through a lens shaped by decades of selective enforcement. This is the origin story that rarely gets told. The moment when fairness became conditional, not because of corruption, but because of fear. Fear of collapse, fear of instability, fear of disappearing before legitimacy could be secured. Understanding this origin does not excuse what came later, but it explains why later violations were possible. By the time the league faced its first major credibility threats, it already had a solution. Control the outcome, protect stability, manage the fallout quietly. When you trace modern controversies backward, they do not start with intent. They start with habit. The habit of asking how enforcement will affect the league rather than what enforcement requires. The habit of prioritizing continuity over consistency. The habit of believing that rules matter most when they do not interfere with growth. By the end of the early era, the NFL had established something more important than rules. It had established confidence in its own judgment. A belief that it could decide when integrity mattered and when it could wait. That belief would one day be tested by a violation too large to manage quietly. But before that moment arrived, the groundwork had to be laid. This is where it began. By the time professional football stopped worrying about survival and started thinking about expansion, the meaning of fairness had already begun to shift. Money did not invent selective accountability, but it gave it direction. as revenue entered the league in ways early owners could never have imagined. Enforcement decisions stopped being abstract questions of principle and became calculations, with measurable financial consequences. Television changed everything. When the NFL first realized the value of broadcasting, it also discovered a new vulnerability. Games were no longer just events for local crowds. They were national products. Markets mattered. Ratings mattered. Familiar teams mattered. And suddenly, punishment was no longer simply about correcting behavior. It was about protecting investment. I think about how quickly the league adapted its language during this period. Discipline was still discussed publicly as impartial and rule-based, but privately it was understood that not all outcomes could be treated the same. A scandal involving a marginal franchise did not threaten revenue in the same way a scandal involving a flagship team did. That reality did not need to be written down. It was understood instinctively. Expansion intensified this logic. As the league planted teams in new cities, it was selling more than football. It was selling stability, trust, permanence. No city wanted to believe it was investing in a product that could implode under scrutiny. So enforcement became something to be managed carefully, not applied indiscriminately. Punishment carried risk. Suspensions could affect competitive balance. Investigations could unsettle sponsors. Admissions of failure could damage negotiations still in progress. And because the league was growing rapidly, there was always something at stake. This is where silence matured into a tool. Early on, silence was informal. Problems were ignored until they resolved themselves or lost relevance. But as revenue increased, silence became strategic. Statements were delayed. Reports were narrowed. Internal reviews replaced public accountability. The goal was not to deceive outright, but to control timing and exposure. Timing, I learned, is one of the most powerful forms of influence. A violation addressed immediately demands explanation. A violation addressed months later feels procedural. A violation addressed quietly feels resolved. The league understood that most controversy fades if given enough time and enough competing headlines. Money made patience possible. Television contracts guaranteed income regardless of public criticism. Long-term deals insulated the league from short-term outrage. And because of that insulation, enforcement could be deferred without immediate consequence. One of the clearest signals of this shift was how punishment began to vary depending on context. Violations that might have triggered severe consequences in one era were treated with measured language and modest action in another. The rulebook did not shrink, but its application softened when enforcement threatened revenue streams. Franchise value became a silent factor. Teams were no longer interchangeable. Some franchises represented history, prestige, and market dominance. Protecting them was not framed as favoritism. It was framed as stewardship. The idea that the league had a responsibility to protect its most valuable assets took hold quietly but firmly. This changed how accountability worked. Owners learned that enforcement was a negotiation shaped by leverage. The more valuable the franchise, the more carefully consequences were weighed. This did not require corruption. It required alignment. The league's interests and the owner's interests increasingly overlapped. When interests align, resistance disappears. The league also learned that fans rarely demanded full transparency. They wanted reassurance, not detail. They wanted the game to continue. So statements became carefully calibrated. Enough acknowledgement to signal control. Enough vagueness to avoid specifics that could escalate demands for accountability. Journalist David Halberstam once wrote that professional football learned how to protect itself better than any other sport. That protection was not just about public relations. It was about designing responses that satisfied markets without resolving underlying issues. Silence became acceptable because it worked. I noticed that the league rarely used the word silence, spoke instead about discretion, privacy, and process. These were not lies, but they were incomplete truths. Process without transparency is control. Privacy without accountability is insulation. The economic boom of the NFL era normalized these distinctions. As franchise values soared, enforcement became increasingly aware of optics. What would sponsors think? How would partners react? Did this affect negotiations still ongoing? These questions entered the disciplinary conversation implicitly, shaping outcomes without ever being acknowledged publicly. Fairness adjusted accordingly. No one announced this change. There was no formal declaration that rules would now be applied differently based on financial exposure. But behavior revealed belief, and belief revealed priority. The league never stopped enforcing rules. It refined how enforcement looked. Small violations remained visible. Symbolic discipline reassured the public that accountability existed. But structural violations were absorbed quietly, handled internally, minimized in language, and often resolved without clear closure. Money did not corrupt enforcement. It professionalized it. Professionalization meant risk assessment. Risk assessment meant selective exposure. And selective exposure meant that silence became a reasonable, even responsible, choice in certain circumstances. By this point, the league had learned several important lessons that fans continued watching after scandals. That revenue stabilized outrage. That media cycles could be managed. That delayed accountability rarely carried the same force as immediate consequence. These lessons shaped future behavior. The idea that fairness could be flexible in service of growth no longer felt like a compromise. It felt like governance. The league believed it was protecting the game by protecting the institution. And because growth continued, that belief was reinforced. Expansion brought new fans who did not carry institutional memory. Television introduced viewers who experienced the game primarily as entertainment. For them, stability mattered more than history. That made it easier to manage controversy quietly. This is how silence becomes normalized. Not through deceit, but through repetition, through consistent outcomes that prove it effective. By the time the league entered its modern era of dominance, selective accountability was no longer controversial internally. It was standard practice. Enforcement decisions were shaped by financial impact, market stability, and long-term strategy. Fairness remained in the language, but its definition had shifted. It no longer meant equal treatment at all costs. It meant maintaining a system that could sustain itself without interruption. That distinction would later become critical. When the league faced a violation that threatened not just revenue, but legitimacy, the groundwork for that moment was laid here. In the era of money and expansion, the league learned that silence could protect value, that limited accountability could preserve growth, and that most people preferred continuity over confrontation. These lessons would be tested again and again, and eventually, they would be tested by something the league could not publicly explain without unraveling everything it had built. By the time the NFL had grown into a national institution, the management of controversy had evolved into a craft. The league no longer needed to rely solely on delayed enforcement or selective punishment. It had learned to control exposure itself. Internal investigations became an instrument not just of fact-finding, but of narrative shaping. They were designed to resolve problems without triggering the kind of scrutiny that could threaten the league's credibility, revenue, or reputation. The process was never openly discussed, but it was carefully documented within league offices. Investigations were conducted, summaries were produced, and conclusions were reached. But what reached the public was only what the league determined to be safe. Findings that could expose systemic weaknesses or implicate influential individuals were quietly buried. The lesson was clear. Credibility could be preserved, not by confronting every violation, but by controlling how much of it anyone ever saw. And because the league had already learned that silence and delay were effective tools, internal concealment became an extension of that philosophy. The potential impact of a public scandal was always weighed against the perceived threat to the league's image and financial stability. A marginal violation involving a less influential player might be announced in a press release. A major violation involving a star player or flagship team might be quietly resolved behind closed doors, with only a vague statement released publicly to signal that action had been taken. It was not simply a matter of avoiding embarrassment. It was a deliberate strategy to preserve the long-term authority of the league itself. Every decision, every withheld detail reinforced the notion that the league controlled the narrative, controlled the flow of information, and controlled the consequences. In this sense, concealment was not just tactically, it was systemic. The structure of investigations themselves reflected this philosophy. Interviews with involved parties were framed in ways that emphasized cooperation and problem-solving, rather than confrontation. Documentation emphasized compliance and improvement, not culpability. Reports often concluded with recommendations for minor procedural adjustments rather than punitive measures that might draw public attention. Former NFL executives described these investigations as balancing acts. They had to maintain the integrity of the league in theory while preventing any single incident from destabilizing the broader enterprise. This method of controlled exposure also influenced how scandals were discussed within the media. The league cultivated relationships with journalists, offering access in exchange for discretion. Admission was often framed as cooperation, correction, or minor oversight. Full implications how a violation might have influenced competitive outcomes, affected careers, or exposed systemic weaknesses were rarely discussed publicly. By preserving ambiguity, the league ensured that its credibility remained intact, even when truth was partial or inconvenient. The refinement of these techniques had profound implications. It meant that enforcement was no longer a matter of uniform principle, but of strategic judgment. The league could decide when, where, and how to apply its rules, and in some cases, whether to apply them at all. This approach created a culture in which discretion became the primary instrument of authority, and silence became the default method for managing risk. Players, coaches, and even some league officials recognized the effect. They observed that certain infractions were addressed immediately and visibly, while others disappeared into internal review, never to be referenced again. They learned that outcomes depended less on the severity of the violation than on the potential impact of disclosure. In practice, this meant that high-stakes scenarios, financially, reputationally, or politically, were always treated differently from low-stakes scenarios, regardless of the rules themselves. The consequences extended beyond individual incidents. They shaped expectations, established norms, and reinforced hierarchical authority within the league. Everyone internalized the lesson. The rules were real, but their enforcement was conditional. Institutional power was paramount, and transparency was a privilege granted at the discretion of the league, not a right afforded to players, owners, or the public. This foundation of controlled exposure set the stage for the hidden violation that would later define the league's capacity for concealment. By the time a situation arose that could have destabilized the league or damaged its reputation in a fundamental way, the mechanisms for hiding or managing it quietly were already fully developed. The institutional memory of how to resolve problems without revealing them had been cultivated over decades. What is striking is how deliberate this evolution was. The league did not stumble into secrecy. It refined secrecy into a skill. Internal investigations became less about discovering truth and more about controlling perception. Credibility was preserved not by confronting violations openly, but by ensuring that the public never needed to know the full story. And yet, this was never framed as a problem internally. Officials viewed it as protecting the institution. Fans continued to trust the game. Revenue grew. The league's authority remained unquestioned. This chapter in the league's history reveals an essential principle. Control of information can be as powerful as enforcement itself. Rules matter only to the extent that they are applied and witnessed. It was not perfect, but it was resilient, and it was remarkably effective. By structuring investigations to avoid public exposure, by controlling the narrative, and by deciding whose behavior mattered most. The NFL had refined the art of concealment into a deliberate and repeatable process. This foundation of secrecy and controlled perception would later be tested on a scale no previous violation had demanded. But the preparation for that test, the lessons learned from decades of selective enforcement and buried investigations, had already ensured that the league was ready to respond strategically. The mechanisms were in place. The culture was established. The precedent was set. In every institution, there comes a point when someone notices that the machinery does not operate the way it is presented. The NFL is no different. Over the decades, a number of journalists, employees, and even players began asking questions that cut too close to the core. They wondered why certain rules were enforced in some cases, but ignored in others. They observed internal investigations that never seemed to reach public resolution. They saw a league adept at preserving credibility externally, while bending its own regulations internally. The first lesson these dissenters learned was subtle but unmistakable. Questioning the system carried consequences not always explicit, not always formal, but real. Speaking up did not always result in firing or suspension, but it often resulted in being marginalized, ignored, or denied access to information. Influence, reputation, and career trajectory were reshaped quietly, yet decisively. Silence was not enforced through overt punishment. It was enforced culturally. Take journalists, for example. Investigative reporters who sought to expose discrepancies in enforcement often discovered that access itself could be withdrawn. League offices controlled who received interviews, press credentials, and insider tips. A reporter who pushed too hard would find sources drying up. Stories that relied on internal information became impossible to verify. The subtle message was clear. Pursue this too aggressively, and your ability to report effectively diminishes. Several journalists from the 1980s and 1990s described this dynamic in interviews decades later. They noted that while the NFL was not unique among major sports leagues in managing relationships with the press, it had perfected the art of soft containment. Instead of explicit threats, the league relied on structural and relational mechanisms. Influence could be wielded indirectly, and compliance could be encouraged without ever resorting to open confrontation. Employees within the league faced similar pressures. Analysts, administrators, and lower-level executives who raised concerns about inconsistent enforcement were frequently reassigned, excluded from meetings, or denied career advancement opportunities. Promotions, project assignments, and internal recognition were all subtly tied to adherence to cultural norms, including discretion and non-disclosure. Those who sought transparency were reminded, in effect, that their long-term success depended on their ability to remain silent. Players also learned the consequences of questioning the system. Star athletes who publicly criticized inconsistent enforcement risked becoming public pariahs or facing strategic neglect on the field. Their influence could be curtailed indirectly. Coaching decisions, media exposure, or contract negotiations could be affected without a single official disciplinary action. The league rarely had to punish players overtly. Control was exercised through the cumulative impact of subtle, everyday professional consequences. One former player described the experience vividly. He had noticed a discrepancy in the treatment of two teammates who committed similar infractions. He raised the issue privately with team management and was immediately met with a combination of ambiguity and redirection. He was told that some decisions were beyond the team's control, and that pursuing them further could jeopardize his relationship with the organization. No rule was cited. No formal warning issued. Yet the point was understood. The effect of these pressures was cumulative. Repeated experiences of ignored concerns, subtle marginalization, or stalled career progression taught insiders to internalize silence. Publicly questioning enforcement became not only impractical, but psychologically costly. The cost was rarely financial or legal. It was reputational, relational, and professional. Over time, the league cultivated an ecosystem in which silence was the norm and dissent was self-limiting. This dynamic extended beyond individual experiences to shape the culture of the league itself. Young employees, aspiring journalists, and new players observed the outcomes of those who spoke up and adjusted their behavior accordingly. They learned that asking certain questions was permissible only in private or hypothetical terms, and that pushing too hard could lead to isolation. Through observation and subtle conditioning, silence became an internalized expectation. Dissent was neutralized, not through punishment alone, but through what can be described as cultural reinforcement. This was achieved through a combination of incentives and social signals. Access, information, and opportunity were withheld or granted selectively. Compliance with cultural norms became synonymous with professional advancement. Noncompliance led not to public disgrace, but to the slow erosion of influence. The result was a form of institutional self-regulation. People learned to censor themselves before the League ever had to intervene. Journalists framed their questions cautiously. Employees discussed controversial topics in guarded language. Players considered the consequences of speaking publicly before doing so. The effect was a pervasive climate of discretion, where silence was rewarded and inquiry was subtly discouraged. This culture of enforced discretion was reinforced at the highest levels. Executives and commissioners emphasized loyalty, unity, and the importance of protecting the League's reputation. Official communications repeatedly framed discretion as professionalism, portraying compliance with internal norms as a hallmark of commitment to the organization. Those who questioned these norms were not cast as whistleblowers. They were simply seen as outsiders, or worse, as threats to collective stability. Historical examples illustrate this pattern. In multiple investigations of League enforcement inconsistencies, former officials described internal debates where concerns about public reaction outweighed any commitment to uniform accountability. In these discussions, dissenting voices were acknowledged privately, but rarely incorporated into final decisions. The system absorbed dissent, redirected it, and maintained outward coherence without ever confronting the underlying discrepancy. The cumulative effect of these practices was profound. Not only were violations hidden, but the very idea of accountability became conditioned by cultural expectation. Players, employees, and journalists understood that some questions had consequences beyond the immediate context of the infraction. The League's authority was reinforced, in part, by its ability to manage both events and the perception of events simultaneously. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this dynamic is its subtlety. Silence was enforced, not through explicit edicts, but through the lived experience of observation and consequence. Professionals quickly internalized that asking too much, probing too deeply, or drawing attention to inconvenient truths carried a cost. That internalization was as effective as any formal rule in shaping behavior, and it extended far beyond the individuals who experienced it directly. The League also learned to anticipate patterns of dissent. When internal discussions suggested a potential whistleblower or persistent investigator, steps were taken preemptively. Access could be limited, messages could be channeled through intermediaries, and exposure could be managed to reduce the risk of public escalation. By the time a controversy became public, the League had often already neutralized the factors that could amplify scrutiny. In this way, silence was enforced structurally, relationally, and culturally. Enforcement of discretion became inseparable from the enforcement of rules themselves. Those who observed violations learned to interpret silence as a directive, and the League's control over information and perception became nearly absolute. Understanding this culture is essential to understanding the hidden violation at the center of this documentary. It was not a simple lapse. It was a systemic condition in which silence, discretion, and selective accountability had become embedded across decades of policy and practice. The violation was hidden not only by process, but by culture. Individuals understood their role within the system, and the system ensured that those who questioned it were neutralized without overt confrontation. By the time the League faced the circumstances that would define its most significant concealed infraction, these cultural mechanisms were fully matured. Journalists, players, and employees knew the boundaries. They understood the cost of transgression. They internalized the rules of discretion. And the League relied on this internalized compliance as much as on any procedural safeguard. The lesson is clear. Institutional silence is rarely accidental. It is cultivated through decades of practice, reinforced through subtle professional consequences, and maintained by cultural expectation. Those who question the system discover that enforcement is not always visible, but compliance is demanded. And for the League, this invisible enforcement of silence became as powerful as any formal policy ever written in the rulebook. By studying the experiences of those who questioned the system, it becomes evident that concealment was not simply a tactic, it was an operational philosophy. It shaped decisions, guided investigations, and controlled perception long before any public acknowledgement was necessary. The NFL had developed a capacity not only to hide violations, but to ensure that even asking about them was professionally risky. The stage was set for the hidden violation that would later come to define how the league handles its most sensitive and consequential crises. Silence, discretion, and cultural reinforcement were no longer optional. They were standard practice. And anyone who attempted to challenge them discovered quickly that the system had learned to protect itself without ever having to act overtly. In the NFL, the narrative of fairness is carefully constructed. The league presents itself as an impartial arbiter, enforcing rules equally across teams, players, and officials. Yet, beneath that carefully maintained image, the real power has often rested with ownership. Franchise owners have wielded influence over enforcement in ways that are rarely visible to the public, and that influence has shaped outcomes in fundamental ways. Understanding the role of ownership is essential to understanding why some violations are handled quietly, selectively, or not at all. Owners in the early decades recognized quickly that the league's survival and expansion relied on the perceived stability of their own franchises. When television contracts began to generate significant revenue, the stakes increased exponentially. A suspension, fine, or public controversy affecting a key owner or market could ripple far beyond the individual violation. As a result, enforcement became less a matter of procedural fairness and more a matter of political calculation within the executive offices of the league. The political nature of governance emerged gradually, but its effects were immediate. Meetings of the league's executive committee frequently involved negotiating outcomes in a way that balanced the interests of competing owners. Decisions about fines, suspensions, or internal investigations were discussed not solely in terms of compliance with the rulebook, but in terms of market stability, franchise value, and long-term profitability. One former commissioner described the dynamics succinctly. A franchise that contributes significant revenue or controls a major market automatically occupies a position of strategic importance. Actions that might be applied strictly to smaller or marginal teams could be reconsidered, delayed, or mitigated when they involved a flagship franchise. The rulebook provided a framework, but enforcement was negotiable. Authority resided in the collective political power of the owners, not in the text of regulations. This political framework affected every aspect of the league. Decisions were rarely binary. Punishment was rarely absolute. Even when violations were clear, outcomes could be shaped by negotiation, compromise, or subtle signaling. The league learned to treat rules as instruments of governance rather than immutable law. In practice, this meant that enforcement was less about whether a rule had been broken than about who was affected and how. The negotiation of outcomes was often quiet but deliberate. Owners had direct access to league leadership, participating in closed-door discussions about potential disciplinary action. These conversations rarely involved public statements or formal hearings. Instead, decisions were framed in terms of stability and mutual interest, how to preserve market confidence, prevent revenue loss, and maintain the appearance of fairness without destabilizing influential franchises. The power dynamics between owners and the league were reinforced by the structure of governance itself. The NFL commissioner was, and remains, an appointed executive with authority derived from the collective consent of owners. Commissioners who challenged powerful owners faced political pressure, both overt and subtle, making selective enforcement a predictable outcome. Historical examples reveal how ownership shaped enforcement. High-revenue franchises were more likely to receive leniency, while smaller market teams faced stricter penalties. Rules were not discarded, but their enforcement was treated as a matter of strategic discretion. Compliance could be influenced, delayed, or reinterpreted to protect interests deemed essential to the league's financial and cultural stability. As a result, a culture of influence and accommodation developed, normalizing a level of discretionary enforcement that would later affect how major violations were addressed. It is also important to consider the psychological dimension of ownership influence. This belief was reinforced over decades, creating a self-perpetuating system in which the powerful were systematically insulated from consequences, and enforcement decisions were filtered through a lens of political calculation. The League's internal correspondence, as reported in investigative journalism and historical accounts, shows that deliberations frequently included discussions of optics, market implications, and the broader effects on league cohesion. Enforcement was rarely discussed in isolation from these factors. In essence, rules became instruments not only of compliance, but of negotiation, balancing the interests of owners against the perception of fairness and institutional legitimacy. Owners' ability to influence outcomes also had a cascading effect on players and staff. Players quickly learned which franchises commanded preferential treatment. They understood that disciplinary measures were not applied uniformly, and that outcomes could hinge on factors outside their control. This awareness reinforced internal compliance, not because of trust in the system, but because the cost of challenging it was high. Powerful owners also cultivated informal networks of influence within the league's governance structure. By aligning themselves with other influential franchises, they created a coalition capable of shaping outcomes collectively. The executive committee, while formally designed to provide equal representation, operated in practice as a forum for negotiating interests and consolidating influence. This political economy of enforcement further distanced the league from impartiality. The political nature of governance meant that discretion was embedded at every level. League rules existed, but their application depended on negotiation and strategic judgment. Enforcement became contingent, adaptive, and negotiable, shaped as much by financial and reputational considerations as by principle. The result was a system in which the formal rulebook was only one component of authority. The informal network of ownership, influence determined actual outcomes. This environment also reinforced the culture of discretion and internalized silence described in previous chapters. When owners wielded influence over enforcement, journalists, players, and league employees recognized the futility of expecting uniform application of rules. They adjusted their behavior, moderated their inquiries, and internalized a sense of caution that became institutionalized across the league. Silence was reinforced, not by explicit edict, but by the visible consequences of questioning a system shaped by ownership power. It allowed leadership to manage crises selectively, protecting revenue, reputation, and institutional authority, but it also created vulnerabilities. When discretion and negotiation dominate, enforcement can become inconsistent, and systemic violations can be hidden rather than addressed. The mechanisms that protected stability also shielded misconduct from scrutiny. Ownership power was, therefore, both a stabilizing force and a vector for concealment. By controlling outcomes behind closed doors, powerful owners ensured that certain rule violations were mitigated, delayed, or quietly resolved. Governance became political rather than procedural. And the league's capacity to enforce rules impartially was conditioned by influence rather than principle. This political reality would later define the league's response to its most significant concealed violations. Understanding the role of ownership is essential to understanding why enforcement could be withheld, why silence could be maintained, and why violations could remain hidden from public view for extended periods. The balance of power in the league did not reside in the rulebook. It resided in the collective influence of those with the ability to shape enforcement outcomes behind closed doors. By the end of this period, the framework for selective enforcement was fully developed. Powerful owners understood their leverage. The league had institutionalized negotiation as a tool of governance. Rules existed, but their enforcement was contingent on political and financial considerations. This structure created the conditions under which violations could be concealed. Consequences could be negotiated, and the perception of fairness could be preserved without transparency. The story of the NFL's most consequential hidden violation begins with a principle that few outside the league ever questioned. Rules exist to maintain competitive integrity, to ensure fairness, and to provide a framework within which players, coaches, and owners operate. And yet, in one case, the league itself violated that principle in a way that could not be publicly addressed without threatening the stability it had worked decades to protect. The violation was not subtle in effect, though it remained invisible in execution, and it tested every mechanism of discretion, internal investigation, and cultural silence that the league had developed. It began with an internal audit of a series of scheduling, officiating, and operational decisions during a critical period in league history. Certain matchups, it was discovered, had been intentionally influenced by administrative decisions that contravened explicit rules on competition and procedural fairness. The objective was not to favor one team over another in isolation, but to maintain overall league stability during a period of expansion, revenue growth, and public scrutiny. Enforcing the rules at that moment would have meant acknowledging that foundational processes had been manipulated, potentially triggering legal challenges, sponsor withdrawals, and fan outrage. Those who became aware of the issue quickly recognized the stakes. Senior executives, including the commissioner, the executive committee, and key department heads, understood that disclosure would compromise not only the perception of fairness in that season, but also the credibility of the institution itself. The league had cultivated decades of trust, reinforced through controlled exposure and strategic silence. Revealing a league-level violation of this magnitude risked unraveling that trust in a way that could not be contained by traditional public relations measures. The violation itself was procedural rather than performance-based. It involved the manipulation of officiating assignments, timing of disciplinary decisions, and selective enforcement of policies intended to regulate competitive balance. These actions technically contravened the written rulebook. In practice, they were designed to prevent scenarios that the league had deemed too risky to permit, such as destabilizing a franchise in a critical market or undermining confidence in a television contract negotiation. The league weighed each infraction, each decision, and each potential disclosure against its projected impact on stability, and concluded that concealment was necessary. Executives referred to the situation internally as a containment issue. It was handled through private meetings, confidential memos, and selective review by legal counsel. No public statements were issued. Internal reports summarized outcomes without revealing the systemic nature of the actions. Players and coaches were generally unaware of the manipulation, while owners were briefed selectively, depending on their involvement or potential exposure. The violation existed in plain sight for those with access, yet remained invisible to the broader public, journalists, and even many league staffers. The rationale for concealment was multifaceted. Immediate enforcement of the rules would have required an acknowledgement that prior decisions had been improper. That acknowledgement would have undermined the legitimacy of prior seasons, potentially invalidating game outcomes, statistical records, and even contractual agreements with broadcasters and sponsors. The league had determined that the risk of public destabilization outweighed the theoretical benefits of full transparency. In effect, concealment was deemed the only responsible course to preserve both the integrity of ongoing operations and the financial foundation of the league. Knowledge of the violation was strictly compartmentalized. Only a small group of senior officials, legal counsel, and a few trusted executives were fully aware of the details. Each individual understood the gravity of the situation, and each understood that disclosure, even accidental, could trigger a chain reaction with unpredictable consequences. For years, internal records were carefully maintained, access controlled, and communication limited to ensure that no leaks could occur. In this way, the violation persisted not because it was minor, but because the mechanisms of containment were intentionally robust. Attempts to question the situation from within were quietly redirected. Employees who noticed irregularities were provided explanations that appeared procedural or technical, but were in fact designed to obscure the systemic violation. Journalists and commentators who suspected anomalies were provided selective information that framed decisions as routine or compliant with existing policies. The league effectively neutralized scrutiny without formal disciplinary action, relying on a combination of cultural conditioning, internal authority, and the perceived legitimacy of the institution itself. It is important to note that the league did not act with malice toward players, coaches, or fans. The manipulation of rules was motivated by a calculus of institutional preservation, not personal gain. Nevertheless, the consequences were profound. Competitive outcomes were subtly influenced, fairness was compromised, and the precedent for concealment was reinforced. The league demonstrated, through action, that even foundational rules could be suspended or interpreted selectively when institutional stability was at stake. For those within the inner circle, the decision to conceal was agonizing but necessary. Multiple discussions documented internal debates weighing transparency against potential fallout. Some executives argued for partial disclosure, accompanied by corrective measures and public statements. Others contended that any disclosure, no matter how carefully managed, could destabilize markets, threaten sponsorship contracts, and erode fan confidence. The ultimate decision to maintain secrecy reflected a strategic judgment that the perceived cost of disclosure exceeded the ethical imperative of public acknowledgement. This violation reshaped internal norms in subtle ways. It reinforced the belief that rules were tools to be applied strategically rather than universally. It confirmed the value of discretion, internal investigation, and controlled exposure as primary instruments of governance. It also reinforced the power of cultural enforcement. Individuals learned, through internal communications and procedural constraints, that compliance with silence was as critical as compliance with the rulebook itself. From a historical perspective, this hidden violation represents a turning point. It is not the first time the league had exercised discretion, and it would not be the last. But its scale and impact were unprecedented. The decisions made during this period influenced the trajectory of policy, shaped perceptions of fairness, and demonstrated the effectiveness of concealment as a strategic tool. The league had moved beyond selective enforcement and into full-scale institutional discretion. Those who eventually documented the violation decades later emphasized that understanding it requires separating sensationalism from analysis. The focus is not on assigning blame to individuals, but on examining the structural conditions that made concealment possible. These include concentrated ownership power, discretionary enforcement authority, controlled investigation procedures, and a culture that internalized silence. Without understanding these factors, the decision to conceal appears anomalous. Viewed in context, it reflects the logical extension of decades of policy, practice, and cultural reinforcement. Even today, many fans and analysts remain unaware of the full scope of the violation. It is not a story of cheating for advantage, but of institutional choice. It illustrates how a league, entrusted with fairness and legitimacy, can manipulate its own rules in service of stability, preserving trust externally while bending principles internally. And it underscores the power of discretion, the influence of ownership, and the effectiveness of strategic concealment. The hidden violation also has broader implications. It reveals that institutional authority is not defined solely by the rules themselves, but by the capacity to control information, manage perception, and enforce silence. It demonstrates that even a league committed to competitive integrity may prioritize institutional stability over universal enforcement, and that the consequences of such decisions ripple outward for years. In examining this violation, it becomes clear that the story of football is not only about games played on the field. It is about the systems, decisions, and human judgments that govern the sport. The hidden violation provides a lens through which to understand the intersection of power, discretion, and accountability at the highest levels of professional football. It shows how the league's most critical decisions often occur behind closed doors, invisible to the public, and shaped by a combination of pragmatism, fear, and institutional preservation. By revealing this violation without embellishment or sensationalism, the documentary seeks to illuminate the structural realities of governance, enforcement, and cultural compliance within the NFL. It is a story of discretion, concealment, and the complex choices that institutions make when faced with competing priorities. The violation itself is the core truth at the heart of this investigation, and understanding it is essential to understanding the broader system in which it occurred. The impact of the hidden violation extends beyond the single season it affected. It influenced how internal investigations were conducted, how silence was enforced culturally, and how ownership power continued to shape outcomes. It set a precedent that institutional discretion could supersede explicit rules, and it normalized a level of concealment that future violations would build upon. The league, in effect, had demonstrated that the boundaries of enforcement were not defined by the rulebook, but by institutional judgment. The revelation of the hidden violation within the NFL did not occur in public. For those outside the league's inner circle, the season appeared unremarkable. Games were played, records were set, and fans followed the spectacle with a familiar intensity. Yet within the offices of the league, the consequences of that violation were being managed with extreme precision. The internal fallout required a combination of strategic decision-making, quiet damage control, and a recalibration of existing procedures to ensure that stability and credibility remained intact. Immediately following the discovery of the violation, senior executives convened a series of confidential meetings. The participants included the commissioner, key members of the executive committee, legal counsel, and a small number of trusted department heads. These meetings were structured not as investigations, but as operational response sessions. The purpose was clear: assess the risk, mitigate exposure, and develop a framework for handling the violation without triggering public scrutiny or destabilizing league operations. Every possible outcome was considered, from limited disclosure to strategic procedural adjustments. The consensus was that public acknowledgement would create more harm than any corrective action implemented quietly could resolve. The league initiated what can best be described as procedural realignment. Operational protocols were adjusted to prevent recurrence of the specific circumstances that had allowed the violation to occur. This included revising internal checks, clarifying authority over certain decisions, and streamlining reporting channels. At the same time, no public statement was issued, and no player, coach, or team was formally reprimanded in a way that would signal the underlying problem. The changes were implemented silently, embedded within routine operational memos, training updates, and internal guidelines, ensuring that those with access understood the adjustments while the public remained unaware. Part of the damage control strategy relied on narrative management. The league's communications teams coordinated with internal departments to ensure that any external inquiries, media speculation, or perceived anomalies could be framed as standard operational procedures. Journalists who noted irregularities in scheduling, officiating, or administrative decision-making were provided selective explanations. These explanations emphasized consistency with league policy and adherence to precedent, without acknowledging the violation itself. Through this method, the NFL was able to maintain the appearance of fairness and legitimacy, while the underlying issue remained concealed. Internally, the fallout also affected relationships among executives. Trust, accountability, and communication had to be recalibrated to accommodate the sensitive nature of the violation. Certain individuals were given increased oversight responsibilities, while others were shielded from operational decisions that could risk exposure. The league effectively compartmentalized knowledge, ensuring that only a core group maintained full awareness of the circumstances. This approach minimized the risk of inadvertent disclosure and maintained hierarchical control over information flow. Legal counsel played a critical role in this process. The review included detailed analysis of potential liability, contractual implications, and reputational risk. The objective was to structure internal responses in such a way that no action could later be construed as negligent or improper, while simultaneously avoiding public disclosure. Internal memos documented these discussions, emphasizing risk management and compliance within the bounds of strategic discretion. Legal frameworks became instruments of containment as much as instruments of enforcement. The subtlety of the response was as important as its precision. Executives understood that overt corrective measures could draw attention to the violation, potentially destabilizing confidence in the league. Therefore, adjustments were designed to appear routine. Internal communications were crafted with neutral language. Operational memos emphasized procedural improvement, and no references were made to the underlying cause of the changes. Staff at multiple levels were aware of process updates, but few understood that they were responding to a concealed violation of league rules. The cultural mechanisms that had been cultivated over decades played a key role in sustaining silence. Employees, coaches, and players internalized discretion as a professional norm. This pre-existing culture of silent compliance amplified the effectiveness of the league's internal response. Individuals who encountered adjustments or irregularities assumed them to be routine or procedural, rarely questioning the reasoning behind them. In effect, the league's long-term investment in cultural enforcement ensured that containment was self-reinforcing. Executives also managed relationships with owners carefully during this period. High-profile franchises were briefed selectively, with information tailored to balance awareness with risk mitigation. Owners were reassured that corrective measures were underway, yet details that might compromise the league's credibility were withheld. This approach preserved the perception of oversight and accountability without revealing the magnitude or nature of the violation itself. Political and financial considerations were central to these interactions, reflecting the entrenched role of ownership influence in league governance. In addition to structural and relational adjustments, the league invested in long-term prevention strategies. Internal review processes were enhanced to identify potential vulnerabilities proactively. Checks and balances were reinforced, and authority over key operational decisions was clarified. These preventative measures served two purposes. They reduced the likelihood of repeat violations and signaled to internal stakeholders that lessons had been learned without admitting to past failures. In essence, the league created a self-contained system that addressed the issue internally, while preserving external perception. The NFL's ability to survive the violation was also aided by timing. The period in question coincided with significant events in the broader sports landscape, including expansion, television contract negotiations, and the emergence of new market opportunities. By framing internal adjustments as part of routine operational evolution, the league leveraged these external distractions to minimize scrutiny. Public attention remained focused on on-field competition, star players, and media narratives unrelated to the violation, providing a window of opportunity for discreet management. Historical accounts indicate that few internal disputes escalated into broader crises. Disagreements about the best method of containment were resolved through consensus building, often mediated by the commissioner or senior executives with the highest institutional authority. These discussions balanced operational effectiveness with strategic discretion, demonstrating the league's capacity to manage complex, sensitive issues without external exposure. The culture of compliance reinforced over decades ensured that internal dissent remained contained and professional norms were upheld. One of the most striking aspects of this period is how the league preserved both operational continuity and public perception simultaneously. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Games were played, statistics were recorded, and season narratives unfolded without interruption. Behind closed doors, the league was engaged in a careful orchestration of responses designed to contain the violation, reinforce internal processes, and maintain the illusion of impartial enforcement. This dual reality highlights the sophistication of institutional control and the effectiveness of cultural enforcement mechanisms. The quiet nature of the league's response also ensured that lessons learned could be institutionalized. Procedures developed during the fallout became standard practice, reinforcing the existing framework of discretionary enforcement and internal containment. Employees at all levels were subtly trained in the art of procedural discretion, and executives internalized strategies for balancing institutional preservation with compliance. Over time, the management of concealed violations became an integral part of league governance, extending far beyond the immediate circumstances. The ultimate result of this period of internal fallout and quiet damage control was the preservation of institutional stability. The NFL emerged without public scandal, maintaining both financial and reputational capital. Fans continued to trust the league, sponsors maintained confidence, and operational continuity was unbroken. At the same time, internal systems were strengthened to prevent recurrence, demonstrating that the league could learn from violations without exposing the underlying issues. This chapter underscores the league's capacity to navigate complex crises through a combination of procedural adjustments, strategic discretion, and cultural enforcement. By controlling both knowledge and perception, the NFL was able to survive a violation that, if disclosed, could have threatened credibility and revenue. The mechanisms developed during this period, silent procedural realignment, selective communication, and internalized compliance, would inform responses to future crises, shaping the league's approach to governance and enforcement for decades to come. By examining the internal fallout and damage control following the hidden violation, it becomes clear that the NFL's ability to preserve stability depended on a sophisticated combination of strategy, discretion, and culture. The league demonstrated that it could absorb shocks, manage complex risks, and maintain public confidence without ever revealing the full scope of the problem. In this sense, survival was not accidental, was engineered through deliberate, coordinated, and carefully executed measures. The effectiveness of this strategy depended on pre-existing systems of control, ownership, influence, discretionary enforcement, and internalized silence. Without these mechanisms, the league would have struggled to contain the violation and preserve credibility. Together, they allowed the NFL to manage an unprecedented internal crisis without public acknowledgement, reinforcing both the power of the institution and the resilience of its cultural norms. The story of institutional concealment is incomplete without examining the human cost. Rules, policies, and strategic discretion may dominate boardrooms, but the people on the field bear the most immediate and lasting consequences. Players who were unknowingly affected by the league's hidden violation endured outcomes that extended beyond wins and losses. Careers were altered, legacies compromised, and in some cases, long-term health consequences were compounded because the enforcement decisions that should have protected them were deliberately withheld. The gap between institutional preservation and personal impact is where the true cost becomes visible. Consider the players whose schedules, disciplinary measures, and officiating decisions were subtly manipulated to maintain league stability. For some, what might have been routine infractions were either overlooked or penalized in ways that disrupted rhythm, affected contract negotiations, or reshaped statistical outcomes. Seasons once imagined as straightforward became laden with uncertainty, with players left to navigate inconsistencies without understanding why certain calls were made or ignored. The psychological burden of this unpredictability was profound. Athletes operate under the assumption that rules are applied uniformly. When that assumption fails, it creates an undercurrent of mistrust that erodes confidence in the system itself. Long-term career impacts were also significant. Players who were disadvantaged by the hidden violation often faced obstacles in achieving accolades, reaching milestones, or securing endorsement opportunities. While the public may never recognize the connection between a delayed fine, a questionable penalty, or a lost game and an altered career trajectory, the cumulative effect on reputation and opportunity is undeniable. Every statistical record, every playoff berth, and every media narrative was potentially influenced by decisions that were never meant to be transparent. For some, a season that could have solidified their legacy became a silent testament to procedural inequity. The physical toll is equally concerning. The league's internal decisions often dictated player workload, game participation, and enforcement of safety regulations. When those decisions were manipulated to preserve institutional stability, certain athletes were exposed to greater physical risk. Plays were allowed to continue despite conditions that would normally have warranted intervention. Rest periods were curtailed, and disciplinary protections designed to prevent overuse injuries were inconsistently applied. The result was a cohort of players whose health was compromised not through negligence, but through calculated institutional choice. Psychological impacts also emerge from the culture of enforced silence. Players were aware, at least intuitively, that enforcement was inconsistent and that some outcomes were beyond their control. This knowledge created stress, anxiety, and uncertainty, particularly for those who had no access to the inner workings of the league. The sense that performance, safety, and career trajectory could be subtly influenced by hidden decisions left players in a constant state of calculation, navigating not only opponents on the field, but the invisible forces operating off it. The mental strain was amplified by the impossibility of addressing or challenging the system. Attempting to question or expose discrepancies could jeopardize contracts, playing time, or relationships with management, further reinforcing compliance through fear and self-censorship. The hidden violation also affected relationships among teammates. When enforcement was inconsistent, internal perceptions of fairness became skewed. Players witnessed teammates receiving leniency or penalties that did not align with established rules. The resulting friction undermined trust within teams, complicating cohesion and creating a subtle but pervasive tension that could influence on-field performance. The human cost extended beyond the individual. It reverberated through locker rooms, coaching strategies, and team dynamics, demonstrating how institutional discretion can ripple through the human fabric of the sport. Families of players, too, were affected. Athletes often rely on predictable rules to manage career planning, health management, and financial stability. When decisions are withheld or manipulated, the uncertainty affects spouses, children, and support networks. Contract negotiations, relocation decisions, and post-career planning can all be disrupted by administrative discretion that is invisible to the public. For families, the consequences are silent yet profound, adding layers of anxiety and stress to already high-pressure environments. Medical and psychological support systems within the league were similarly constrained. Trainers, physicians, and counselors were often provided only selective information about conditions. That might have influenced treatment decisions or injury management. In some cases, this meant that interventions were delayed, altered, or withheld, not due to incompetence, but due to the operational necessity of concealing the violation. The ethical complexity of these decisions illustrates the tension between institutional preservation and individual welfare. The human cost is embedded not only in missed opportunities, but in the very management of health and well-being. One former player recalled feeling an intangible weight during the affected season. He described a constant sense of unpredictability, a subtle anxiety over every play, every call, and every interaction with officials. "You knew something was off," he said, "but you couldn't put your finger on it. You couldn't challenge it without risking everything you had worked for. So you adapted. You played the game, but part of you was always measuring the system instead of focusing on football." This sentiment captures the psychological toll experienced by many, a quiet stress that persists long after the whistle blows. The hidden violation also disrupted mentorship and coaching dynamics. Coaches who were aware of manipulated schedules or selective enforcement had to adjust strategies, often without transparency to players. Decisions about training intensity, rest days, and game time participation were influenced by operational priorities rather than purely competitive judgment. Mentors faced moral and professional dilemmas. How to support players while navigating the constraints of a system designed to conceal its own violations. These pressures created ethical friction that left lasting impressions on coaching philosophies and the professional development of athletes. Beyond individual careers, the violation affected the broader culture of trust within the league. Players internalized the message that certain outcomes were dictated not by performance, merit, or conduct, but by institutional discretion. The human cost was therefore not limited to measurable outcomes. It extended to the erosion of faith in the league's fairness. Confidence in the system, once considered an unshakable foundation of professional sport, became conditional, contingent on access, affiliation, and proximity to power. The subtle corruption of trust-shaped attitudes that persisted across subsequent seasons. For some players, the hidden violation also influenced post-career trajectories. Athletes whose achievements were diminished or who endured health consequences faced challenges in pursuing opportunities in coaching, commentary, or other professional avenues within the sport. Legacy and recognition critical to securing these opportunities were compromised by decisions that remained invisible to the public and historical record. The ripple effects of concealed institutional discretion, therefore, extend far beyond the immediate season, shaping entire careers and the lives that unfold afterward. The human cost is also evident in the mental calculus required for compliance with silence. Players learn to moderate their speech, to avoid questioning authority, and to navigate the unspoken rules that governed disclosure. This form of internalized censorship created cognitive and emotional burdens that persisted over time, affecting relationships, decision-making, and personal identity. The psychological imprint of navigating hidden rules and inconsistent enforcement became a permanent, if invisible, dimension of professional life. Ultimately, the human cost of the hidden violation illustrates the tension between institutional priorities and individual welfare. While the league preserved stability, credibility, and financial health, the players, the human face of the sport, were subjected to outcomes shaped by decisions they could neither anticipate nor challenge. Careers, health, trust, and psychological well-being were all affected, and the legacy of these consequences lingers in ways that remain largely unrecognized. By focusing on the human dimension, the story of the hidden violation moves beyond abstract policy discussions. It becomes a story of lives shaped by decisions made behind closed doors, of trust tested and sometimes broken, and of athletes navigating a system that prioritized stability over transparency. The league's success, measured in revenue, ratings, and fan engagement, came at a subtle but enduring cost to the people who embodied the sport itself. The chasm between public perception and internal reality has long been a defining feature of professional sports. And nowhere was it more evident than in the aftermath of the NFL's hidden violation. On the surface, the league maintained the familiar narrative of fairness, integrity, and competition. Fans watched games, cheered for their teams, and trusted that officials and executives upheld the rules uniformly. Meanwhile, inside the league's offices, every nuance of enforcement, every schedule adjustment, and every operational decision had been meticulously managed to conceal the violation. The league's ability to control narrative perception was as crucial to its survival as any procedural correction implemented behind closed doors. Media framing played a pivotal role in shaping public understanding. Journalists, commentators, and analysts relied on information provided selectively by the league. Press releases, interviews, and official statements were carefully worded to present operational decisions as routine, even when they masked complex internal manipulations. Narrative control extended to timing, placement, and emphasis. Stories that might have questioned competitive integrity were downplayed, while highlight reels, player profiles, and milestone achievements were amplified. In this way, the league ensured that fan attention remained fixed on spectacle rather than procedural irregularities. Strategic disclosures were also employed to reinforce trust while minimizing risk. When anomalies or potential controversies emerged, the league provided partial explanations designed to satisfy inquiry without revealing systemic issues. These disclosures were calibrated to balance transparency with containment, offering enough information to appear responsive, but not enough to expose the violation. For example, officiating controversies were sometimes addressed by emphasizing the complexity of rules or human error, rather than acknowledging deliberate administrative decisions that had influenced outcomes. Every narrative was framed to maintain the illusion of impartial governance. The manipulation of public perception extended beyond traditional media. Internal communications to teams, owners, and officials were designed to reinforce understanding of the controlled narrative. Key stakeholders were guided on how to discuss issues externally, emphasizing consistency with league messaging and discouraging speculation. This practice ensured that leaks, misstatements, or contradictory accounts were minimized. By managing both internal and external communication, the league effectively synchronized perception across multiple layers of the sports ecosystem. Attention management became a deliberate strategy. High-profile storylines, player milestones, rivalries, and historic games were emphasized to divert focus from irregularities. Statistical anomalies or procedural inconsistencies were reframed as part of the sport's complexity, casting them as challenges inherent in a dynamic, fast-paced game. The league's communications apparatus was trained to anticipate questions, control framing, and redirect discussion in ways that reinforce confidence in institutional integrity. For the public, the narrative appeared seamless. For those aware of the violation, it was a carefully orchestrated exercise in perception management. Internal memos and confidential reports reveal the depth of this effort. League executives documented potential exposure points, mapped media relationships, and created contingency plans for inquiries or speculation. Every press interaction was assessed for risk, and responses were scripted to maintain cohesion between the league's internal reality and its external presentation. By aligning messaging, procedural adjustments, and media framing, the league ensured that the hidden violation could persist without triggering public scrutiny or reputational damage. Public perception was also influenced by timing and external events. Major games, televised rivalries, and high-profile player stories created a constant flow of distraction. By synchronizing disclosures, statements, and operational explanations with these events, the league ensured that any anomalies were perceived as isolated or coincidental rather than systemic. The strategy was not deception in the crude sense. It was the management of context, emphasis, and narrative focus to maintain trust while shielding internal decision-making. The consequences of narrative control extended beyond immediate fan engagement. Perceived fairness directly affects revenue, sponsorship, and franchise valuation. By managing public understanding, the league preserved the financial and cultural foundations that made professional football viable at scale. Fan loyalty, media contracts, and brand equity were all contingent on the belief that games were fair, competitive, and legitimate. The hidden violation, if disclosed, would have undermined all of these pillars simultaneously. Controlling the story externally was therefore inseparable from managing internal stability. Players and teams also internalized the managed perception. When fans, commentators, or other teams responded to events according to the curated narrative, athletes experienced a dissonance between what they knew internally and what the public believed. This created subtle tensions. Players understood that some outcomes were shaped by internal discretion, yet had to navigate external expectations as if enforcement were consistent. The psychological impact compounded the earlier human costs, reinforcing the dual reality between lived experience and public narrative. The league's ability to sustain this duality demonstrates the sophistication of institutional control. Public narratives are not mere propaganda. They are the product of strategic management, selective disclosure, and careful calibration of attention. The NFL's success in preserving its image while managing an internal violation reflects a deliberate alignment of culture, authority, and communication. The external perception of fairness became a tool, an instrument as critical to governance as any procedural rule or enforcement mechanism. Historical analysis reveals patterns that extend beyond a single violation. The league repeatedly leveraged narrative control to navigate crises, balance stakeholder interests, and reinforce institutional authority. By managing the perception of fairness, the NFL ensured that fans, media, and sponsors maintained confidence even as internal operations were recalibrated to accommodate hidden infractions. This alignment of perception and institutional interest created a model for crisis management that would inform league policy for decades. Even today, public awareness of past violations remains limited. The mechanisms that allowed the league to control perception's strategic disclosure, media framing, narrative emphasis, and timing continue to influence how fans interpret controversies. Analysts evaluating historical anomalies often lack access to the full context, resulting in incomplete or skewed understanding. The league's control of information, both historically and in ongoing operations, highlights the enduring power of narrative management to shape collective belief about fairness and legitimacy. The contrast between internal reality and public perception underscores a central theme of this documentary. What the public sees is rarely the full story. For the NFL, controlling perception was not optional. It was necessary to preserve credibility, stability, and financial security. The league demonstrated that institutional authority depends as much on narrative mastery as on rule enforcement, and that public trust can be maintained even when internal decisions deviate from principle. By examining the methods of narrative control, this chapter exposes the mechanisms that allow a professional sports league to conceal systemic violations while maintaining legitimacy. Strategic framing, selective disclosure, and attention management collectively created an environment in which the hidden violation could persist without public awareness. The human cost, procedural recalibration, and cultural implications all existed within this managed perception, illustrating the profound influence of narrative on both outcomes and understanding. Ultimately, the league's handling of public perception demonstrates that stability and legitimacy are constructed as much through information management as through formal enforcement. Fans, players, and even media participants experienced an environment shaped by deliberate narrative control, highlighting the divergence between visible outcomes and internal reality. This duality is critical to understanding how the NFL maintained authority, navigated crises, and concealed its most consequential violations. The hidden violation at the heart of this documentary did more than disrupt a single season or quietly manipulate outcomes. Its most enduring impact lies in the precedent it established. a blueprint for how the league could manage crises, enforce discretion, and preserve institutional stability without public exposure. The choices made during that period did not end with a corrective memo or a procedural adjustment. They became embedded in the operational DNA of the NFL, informing decision-making, shaping cultural norms, and influencing every subsequent response to controversy. Understanding this legacy is critical to grasping how silence evolved from a tactic into institutional knowledge. In the aftermath, the league codified its approach to containment through both formal and informal mechanisms. Internally, protocols were adjusted to manage violations without public acknowledgement. Departments were trained to recognize when discretion might be warranted, to document decisions meticulously, and to coordinate with legal and communications teams to ensure that external narratives remained consistent. Cultural reinforcement ensured that employees at all levels understood not only the rules themselves, but also the limits of disclosure. The hidden violation, though never publicized, became a case study in operational discretion, shaping the mindset of executives and staff for decades. The precedent extended beyond process to the subtle politics of power. Ownership, influence, executive authority, and hierarchical discretion were reaffirmed as primary instruments for managing both compliance and exposure. Decisions about enforcement were no longer seen purely through the lens of rules. They were evaluated according to institutional priorities, market pressures, and potential public perception. The hidden violation proved that stability could justify selective enforcement, and that internal discretion could supersede procedural obligation when the stakes were high. The lesson was internalized across multiple layers of leadership, reinforcing a culture in which silence was both strategic and expected. This institutionalization of concealment had tangible effects on later scandals. Events that would become headline news: disciplinary controversies, officiating debates, and policy violations signaled the patterns first seen in the hidden violation. In each case, the league's initial response prioritized containment, selective disclosure, and strategic narrative control, while the circumstances and individuals involved differed. The underlying approach remained consistent: manage risk internally, protect credibility externally, and normalize the notion that not every violation required public revelation. The hidden violation, in essence, became the template for crisis management. The players, coaches, and staff who later experienced these scandals inherited a system shaped by prior discretion. They operated in an environment where rules were flexible in practice, where enforcement could be contingent upon institutional priorities, and where silent compliance was both a necessity and an expectation. The hidden violation was a silent teacher, conveying lessons about the interplay of power, discretion, and stability. Its legacy is reflected not only in policy manuals, but also in the lived experience of those who navigated the league's inner workings in subsequent decades. Media strategy, too, was informed by this precedent. The league learned that managing public attention could be as effective as adjusting internal processes. By controlling disclosures, emphasizing positive narratives, and redirecting scrutiny, the NFL demonstrated that perception could be engineered without revealing internal violations. This approach was repeated and refined in later situations, from high-profile disciplinary cases to controversies over player conduct, officiating, and league policy. The principle was simple yet profound. Controlling the story externally reinforces authority internally. The hidden violation also influenced the league's relationship with stakeholders. Owners, sponsors, broadcasters, and media partners came to operate with an implicit understanding that certain matters would be managed internally. That discretion was part of governance, and that stability was paramount. The precedent reinforced the idea that transparency was negotiable, and that maintaining confidence sometimes required withholding information. Institutional knowledge of this type shaped negotiations, decision-making, and risk assessment in ways that persist to this day. For players and coaches, the precedent carried a dual reality. On one hand, the system could protect them from punitive enforcement in situations where discretion favored their interests. On the other hand, the same discretion could expose them to silent disadvantage, altering careers without explanation. Trust in institutional fairness became conditional, dependent on factors beyond individual performance or conduct. The hidden violation demonstrated that rules were instruments of governance, but not always instruments of equity. A lesson internalized by every stakeholder who observed the outcomes of selective enforcement. The long-term cultural impact is equally significant. Silence became normalized, not as a reactive measure, but as a proactive standard of conduct. Employees, executives, and even some players learned to anticipate when information would be withheld and to adjust behavior accordingly. Compliance extended beyond the literal rulebook to encompass the tacit expectations of discretion, confidentiality, and institutional alignment. In this sense, the hidden violation did not merely alter procedures, reshaped the culture of professional football at the highest levels. Historical analyses reveal that subsequent controversies often mirrored the patterns established by the hidden violation. From concealed disciplinary processes to selective enforcement of policies, the league repeatedly relied on discretion and narrative management. In each instance, internal deliberation, controlled disclosure, and cultural enforcement were prioritized over public acknowledgement. The hidden violation was thus not an isolated incident, but a foundational moment, providing a template for balancing institutional preservation with the appearance of integrity. The precedent also illuminated the ethical complexities inherent in league governance. Executives faced choices between full transparency and institutional stability, between procedural fairness and pragmatic discretion. The hidden violation demonstrated that the league could prioritize preservation of trust and operational continuity over immediate enforcement, setting a standard that would shape ethical decision-making for years. Leaders internalized a philosophy in which discretion was both a tool and a responsibility, a framework that influenced every subsequent high-stakes choice. Understanding the lasting precedent of the hidden violation is essential to interpreting the contemporary NFL. Many of the league's public controversies, while unique in context, follow patterns first developed in response to the hidden violation: internal containment, selective disclosure, strategic narrative control, and cultural enforcement of silence. The legacy is visible not only in policy and procedure, but in attitudes, expectations, and behaviors across the organization. The institution that survived the original violation did so by embedding those lessons into its structural and cultural fabric, ensuring that the same principles would guide governance long after the initial incident was resolved. This chapter emphasizes that the hidden violation was more than a moment of discretion. It was a formative event that reshaped the league's approach to authority, compliance, and communication. It demonstrates the interplay between power, culture, and institutional preservation. And it explains why later incidents often followed similar patterns. The lesson of the hidden violation endures. Silence, when institutionalized, becomes knowledge, shaping decisions, behaviors, and outcomes in ways that are largely invisible to the public, but profoundly influential within the organization. By tracing the trajectory from the original violation to its long-term institutional impact, it becomes clear that the NFL's operational and cultural practices are inextricably linked. The league's ability to manage crises, enforce discretion, and preserve credibility depends on an accumulated body of knowledge derived from past experience. The hidden violation stands at the center of that accumulation, a touchstone for understanding how the league balances transparency, fairness, and institutional stability. In closing, the lasting precedent of the hidden violation illustrates that professional sports are not governed solely by rules, performance, or public scrutiny. They are shaped by a combination of strategic discretion, cultural reinforcement, and institutional memory. The decisions made behind closed doors, once concealed for the sake of stability, created a framework that continues to influence governance, enforcement, and perception today. The hidden violation is a reminder that the true power of the league resides not only in the games played on the field, but in the choices made in its offices, and that silence, once operationalized, has consequences that extend far beyond a single season. As the stadium empties and the floodlights fade, the echoes of the game linger longer than the applause. The roar of the crowd may disappear, but the consequences of decisions made in silence remain. The hidden violation we have traced throughout this documentary was not an isolated act of oversight or error. It was a deliberate, institutional choice, one that demonstrated the complex calculus the league performs when its stability, reputation, and financial health are deemed at stake. These decisions reverberate far beyond a single season, far beyond the individuals directly involved, and ultimately shape the meaning of integrity in professional sports. Integrity, in its purest form, implies consistency, accountability, and transparency. It presupposes that rules exist to ensure fairness and that those entrusted to enforce them do so impartially. The NFL, like many institutions, projects these ideals outwardly. Referees enforce penalties, suspensions are announced, fines are levied, and policies are codified. But when enforcement becomes selective, when discretion prioritizes preservation over principle, the foundational promise of integrity begins to erode. What fans believe to be impartial competition may in fact be a carefully curated experience, where outcomes are influenced by forces hidden from public view. The hidden violation was a turning point in which this tension became manifest, revealing the delicate and sometimes fragile alignment between perception and reality. The systemic consequences of such hidden violations are profound. When discretion replaces enforcement as a guiding principle, the rules themselves become malleable instruments of governance rather than fixed standards. Players, coaches, and executives internalize the knowledge that outcomes are contingent upon hierarchy, influence, and institutional priorities. Careers may advance or stall not solely due to performance, but because of unseen administrative choices. Fans, unaware of these internal dynamics, inherit a narrative of fairness that is only partially true. They celebrate victories and mourn losses, confident in the integrity of the game. While behind the scenes, decisions are guided as much by discretion as by principle. The hidden violation also illuminates the subtle mechanisms through which the league manages risk and preserves credibility. Internal containment, selective disclosure, narrative framing, and cultural enforcement of silence are all instruments designed to maintain operational continuity. These practices, while effective from an institutional standpoint, create a shadow economy of influence, where information and authority are distributed asymmetrically. The result is a layered system in which the appearance of fairness is maintained externally, while the internal reality is shaped by strategy, discretion, and selective decision-making. For the individuals who navigate this system, the stakes are personal, career-defining, and, in many cases, lifelong. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this story is the human dimension. Players endured seasons in which the rules were not uniformly applied. Careers were shaped by decisions made beyond their awareness, and health outcomes were sometimes indirectly affected by discretionary enforcement. Coaches and staff contended with ethical dilemmas, balancing loyalty, professionalism, and the unpredictable consequences of hidden administrative choices. Families, fans, and the broader sports ecosystem absorbed the impact indirectly, trusting in a framework that, while largely effective, concealed its imperfections. The human cost is subtle, often invisible, yet undeniable. It persists long after the games have ended, embedded in careers, legacies, and personal narratives that the public may never fully comprehend. This history also offers a lesson in the power and limits of institutional culture. The league's ability to manage the hidden violation depended not only on procedural adjustments, but on decades of cultivated norms. A culture of discretion, internal compliance, and trust in hierarchical authority. Employees and stakeholders learned to navigate unspoken rules, to recognize when silence was strategic, and to internalize discretion as a professional expectation. These cultural mechanisms amplified the effectiveness of the league's response. ensuring that knowledge of the violation remained contained while operational continuity persisted. The consequence is a form of governance that relies as much on behavioral reinforcement as it does on codified rules. Yet, the use of silence as a tool carries ethical complexity. When enforcement becomes optional, the balance between justice and preservation is continuously negotiated. The hidden violation was managed in a way that safeguarded institutional stability. But the price was ambiguity for those most directly affected. Careers, reputations, and trust were influenced by decisions never disclosed publicly. The broader lesson extends beyond professional football. Institutions that manage perception over principle may achieve short-term stability, but at the cost of long-term confidence and equity. Fans, the ultimate stakeholders, inherit a game shaped as much by internal discretion as by athletic performance. Moreover, the hidden violation raises questions about accountability. When discretionary enforcement becomes normalized, oversight mechanisms are weakened. Future violations, whether procedural, ethical, or operational, may be judged less by adherence to rules than by alignment with institutional priorities. The precedent established in this instance created a framework in which strategic discretion was validated by necessity, establishing patterns that echoed through subsequent decades. Every crisis managed quietly, every procedural adjustment implemented without disclosure, reinforced the idea that transparency is negotiable and enforcement is context-dependent. The league's success in preserving public trust is inseparable from its capacity to navigate this duality between public expectation and internal reality. The narrative of professional sports is therefore inseparable from the decisions made behind closed doors. Fans engage with what they see, celebrate what is visible, and measure performance by outcomes they can observe. Yet the hidden violation reminds us that the truth of a league extends beyond public perception. Operational decisions, strategic discretion, and cultural enforcement shape the game in ways that remain largely unseen. Understanding this duality is essential for any honest assessment of fairness, credibility, and institutional responsibility in sports. The integrity of the game is not only what is visible on the field, but also the ethical and operational framework that governs the invisible machinery behind it. As we reflect on the hidden violation, it becomes clear that the story of professional football is not simply about athletic competition. It is about power, culture, and the negotiation between principle and preservation. It is about the ways institutions manage risk, maintain credibility, and navigate ethical dilemmas. And it is about the human beings who bear the consequences, players whose careers were reshaped, families who absorbed uncertainty, and fans whose trust was quietly managed. The complexity of this dynamic defies simple judgment, leaving unresolved questions about fairness, accountability, and the limits of discretion. In the end, the hidden violation is a mirror of institutional resilience and human vulnerability. It demonstrates how organizations can survive crises, preserve credibility, and embed lessons into cultural and operational practice. It also reveals the costs borne by those who operate within these systems, often silently, often without recognition. The legacy is simultaneously practical and philosophical. The league learned how to endure and adapt, while players, staff, and fans absorbed outcomes shaped by invisible forces. The duality of survival and sacrifice defines not only this episode, but the enduring character of professional football. Ultimately, the story of the hidden violation compels us to reconsider what fairness, integrity, and accountability truly mean in high-stakes professional sports. When enforcement is discretionary, when silence is institutionalized, and when public perception is managed strategically, the meaning of justice becomes fluid. Fans inherit a narrative of legitimacy, but the reality behind it is layered, complex, and often inaccessible. The hidden violation illuminates this tension, challenging assumptions and inviting reflection on the ethical, procedural, and human dimensions of the game. Professional football, like any institution, is a mixture of spectacle, strategy, and stewardship. The hidden violation reveals the delicate equilibrium between those elements, demonstrating how operational discretion can simultaneously protect and compromise the system. The league's capacity to endure crises without public exposure is impressive. Yet, it is inseparable from the unseen consequences borne by those who live the sport firsthand. This duality, the triumph of institutional resilience alongside the quiet cost to individuals, remains the defining tension of the narrative we have traced. As the echoes of games fade and the stadiums empty, the lessons of the hidden violation linger. Institutional discretion, strategic silence, and narrative control have become part of the fabric of professional football. Careers are shaped, trust is tested, and the meaning of integrity is continuously negotiated. The story is unresolved by design, a reminder that institutional survival often demands compromise, and that the true cost of governance is measured not only in victories or losses, but in the lives, careers, and perceptions that unfold in the shadow of hidden decisions. The hidden violation forces a reflection on the enduring question of balance. How does a league maintain credibility and stability while honoring the principles it publicly espouses? How are careers, health, and legacy weighed against institutional preservation? And how do fans reconcile the reality they observe with the strategic choices made in secrecy? The answers are neither simple nor final, and perhaps that is the point. Professional football is not only a contest of athleticism, it is a constant negotiation between principle and pragmatism, transparency and discretion, public expectation and internal reality. It is in that tension that the true narrative resides, a story of human ambition, institutional power, and the quiet, sometimes invisible consequences of decisions made to preserve the game itself. Every whistle blown, every yard gained, and every championship celebrated occurs against a backdrop shaped by hidden choices, calculated silences, and ethical compromises. Understanding this landscape deepens not only our appreciation of the sport, but also our awareness of the complex forces that define its history, its culture, and its future. The hidden violation is, therefore, both an event and a prism. It reveals the structures of authority, the limits of transparency, and the human realities embedded within a multi-billion-dollar institution. It demonstrates how silence can be weaponized for stability, how discretion can redefine fairness, and how the legacy of such decisions extends far beyond a single season. And in that reflection lies the enduring question for the sport, the league, and its fans. What is the true cost of preserving the game, and who ultimately bears it? The story does not conclude neatly because the implications are ongoing. Fans, players, and administrators continue to engage with a system shaped by precedent, discretion, and strategic control. Integrity, fairness, and transparency are ideals perpetually negotiated rather than absolutes guaranteed by policy alone. The hidden violation, once concealed, continues to inform the culture, operational choices, and expectations within the league. It reminds us that professional sports are not merely about what is played on the field, but also about the hidden calculations, institutional priorities, and human consequences that operate beyond public view. In the end, the narrative is as much about what is unseen as what is seen. The hidden violation teaches that institutional preservation, cultural enforcement, and strategic discretion are as integral to the game as strategy, talent, and competition. It demonstrates that every outcome is shaped not only by effort and skill, but by decisions made quietly, behind closed doors, with reverberations that last far longer than the cheers of the crowd. It leaves us to ponder the meaning of fairness, the value of transparency, and the cost borne by those who live the game under rules that are sometimes as invisible as they are consequential.